Chiamaka had always been a striking woman, with full hips, a wide smile, and a voice that could charm the toughest of men. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew her beauty had the power to bend people to her will. She was the kind of woman who walked into a room and instantly drew attention, whether she liked it or not. But Chiamaka's beauty was more than skin deep. It was a weapon, and she knew how to wield it. Her mother, Mamachi, had tried countless times to warn her about her ways. Chiamaka, you must not trick men for their money, she would say, her voice tinged with concern. This will lead you nowhere good. You cannot live a life of deceit. But Chiamaka wasn't the kind of woman who listened to advice, especially from her mother. She felt that her mother, although loving, was old fashioned and didn't understand the world in the same way Chiamaka did. To Chiamaka, the world was her oyster, and if a man was foolish enough to fall for her charms, well, then it was his loss. She knew the game and played it well. After all, what did it matter if a few men got their hearts broken? She had bills to pay and dreams of a life filled with luxury and ease. Chiamaka had a childhood friend whom she was very fond of called Mirabel. Mirabel was a devout Christian and had always been there to offer her prayers and advice, but Chiamaka couldn't understand why anyone would choose to live such a humble life. It was not in keeping with her lofty dreams. Mirabel, on her own part, loved her friend. Chiamaka, you need to learn contentment. You cannot continue to live a life governed by greed, Mirabel often said, her tone gentle but firm. You cannot keep using men to get what you want. One day, this lifestyle might just catch up with you. Chiamaka would laugh it off, tossing back her hair and flashing a wicked grin. Mirabel, you worry too much. You're always talking about punishment. You should live a little. Take a chance. Men will give you anything if you know how to ask for it. Mirabel would sigh and shake her head. She could see the path Chiamaka was on, and it worried her. But Chiamaka was stubborn, and she had a way of making everyone around her believe that everything she did was justified. It wasn't long before Chiamaka's schemes began to pay off. The first man she targeted was Collins, a quiet tailor who ran his small shop on the edge of town. He was a simple man, hardworking and earnest, but he had a weakness for women with curves like Chiamaka's. She noticed him watching her the moment she walked past his shop, and with her usual confidence, she walked up to him one afternoon, her smile as sweet as honey. Good afternoon, Collins, she greeted him warmly, her voice like velvet. Good afternoon, Chiamaka, he replied, his eyes lighting up. What can I do for you today? He replied, inviting her into his shop. Oh, I'm looking for something special, Chiamaka replied, leaning over his worktop. I have a special event coming up and I need a dress, a beautiful one, something that will make heads turn. Collins, of course, was more than eager to help her. He was a simple man, and his modest tailoring shop wasn't much to look at, but he loved the idea of making something beautiful for such a beautiful woman. They talked, and soon Chiamaka had him completely wrapped around her finger. She began visiting him regularly, each time leading him on with promises of more business. Eventually, after a few weeks of flirtation, Chiamaka convinced Collins to lend her a large sum of money. She told him it was for an emergency, something urgent, and of course, Collins, completely smitten, handed over the cash without a second thought. The next day, Chiamaka disappeared, not returning the money and leaving behind only an empty promise to pay him back. Collins was left heartbroken and out of pocket. But Chiamaka didn't lose sleep over it. It was just part of the game. She had already moved on to her next target, Obinna, a banker who worked at one of the more prominent banks in town. Obinna was a bit smarter than Collins, but Chiamaka's charm was not to be underestimated. She played her cards carefully, showing up at the bank every few days to chat with Obinna about her financial troubles. She told him she was having a hard time with her investments and needed some help managing her money. Obinna, a generous soul, offered her advice, and Chiamaka spun a tale of woe about how her family was in trouble and she needed to borrow a substantial sum to cover the costs. Obina, eager to show off his wealth and power, didn't hesitate to lend her the money from his own pocket. But just like with Collins, Chiamaka disappeared the moment she had what she wanted. Obina eventually realized he had been duped, but by the time he figured it out, Chiamaka had already moved on to her next conquest. Chiamaka's reputation began to grow, and although Mirabelle had warned her about the dangers of her ways, Chiamaka couldn't help but feel invincible. She had gotten away with it twice. What was to stop her from continuing? She had a taste for luxury now, and she wasn't going to let anything stand in her way. But things were about to take a strange turn. Chiamaka had her sights set on a quiet and attractive government contractor called Bello. Bello was different from the others. He wasn't like Collins, the shy tailor, or Obina, the eager banker. Bello was a well connected man with power, wealth, and a reserved, calculating nature. He had built his empire from the ground up, and he didn't let anyone fool him easily. Chiamaka, of course, was determined to charm him just as she had with the others. She met him at a traditional event where her beauty stood out even among the many well dressed women. Bello, unlike most men who would have immediately been captivated by her curves, was cautious. He watched her from afar, sizing her up. But Chiamaka wasn't intimidated. She made her approach with the same inviting smile she had used countless times before. Good evening, Bello, she said, her voice bright and cheerful. I don't think we've had the pleasure of meeting before. Bello looked at her carefully, his eyes piercing. I believe you're correct, he replied coolly. And what brings you here tonight? Oh, I am just here for some fun, Chiamaka replied, tossing her hair. But I must admit, I'm always looking for new business opportunities. You're a contractor, yes? Bella nodded, still watching her with an air of suspicion. Yes, I am. Well, I have a few projects in mind that could use someone with your expertise, Chiamaka said, leaning in slightly, her voice lowering. Perhaps we could discuss them over dinner? Bella hesitated, but in the end, he agreed to meet her. Chiamaka was excited at the prospect of landing a big catch like Bello. This would be her biggest one yet. Bello followed up with more meetings with Chiamaka, each one more luxurious than the last. Chiamaka charmed him, talked about her investment plans, and wove a story of needing a large sum of money for a new business venture. Bello was cautious, but his interest in her grew. He didn't immediately give her the money she asked for, but Chiamaka wasn't worried. She had learned to be patient. They made arrangements to meet at Bello's office the following week. On that fateful day, Chiamaka arrived at Bello's office at the appointed time, and after a brief meeting with him and one of his advisors, he excused himself while he saw the colleague off for a brief moment. As soon as they left Chiamaka by herself in the office, Chiamaka made her move. She knew this was her chance. She glanced round the office and, with her heart racing with excitement, she quickly made her way to Bello's desk drawer and, with practiced ease, opened it, revealing stacks of cash and land documents. It was everything she had dreamed of: wealth. She took what she needed, stuffing the documents and the money into her white handbag, and left the office hurriedly, making her way out of the building. Just as she was sighing in relief that she had made it out to the streets, she heard the sound of hurried footsteps behind her. Where do you think you're going? Bella's voice was cold and commanding. Chiamaka froze, her heart sinking. She turned in alarm as Bello grabbed her purse from behind, his expression one of utter disbelief. He had returned earlier than expected. Chiamaka, he said, his voice filled with fury. You think you can just take from me? I'll make sure you regret this. Chiamaka's heart raced. She knew she had been caught, but she didn't know how far Bello would go. She tried to play it off with a nervous laugh. Bello, darling, I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me, he snapped. his grip tightening on her handbag. You've taken something that isn't yours, and you're now going to pay for it. Chiamaka's eyes darted around the street, afraid to draw undue attention to herself. She was forced to follow Bello back into the building. She feared being lynched some curious passersby on the street had started to approach. As soon as they got to the door of the building, Bello ordered his security details to grab Chiamaka at once. The two guards swiftly took hold of her and marched her to the back of the building as people looked on in wonder. They dragged her to a waiting van as Chiamaka pleaded with them not to take her to the police. The men pushed her in and got in as well, sitting on either side of her while they waited for Bello to make some phone calls. After what seemed like an eternity, two other uniformed men joined Bello, and after a brief discussion, they swapped places with the first two men on either side of her. Next, a driver got in and Chiamaka watched as Bello walked over to his own car ahead of them and got in. She asked fearfully what was going on and if they were going to the police station at this point, but no one spoke to her. Soon enough, they were on the road, heading towards a place she had never been before. She was offered a bottle of water and some biscuits, which she gratefully accepted, as she had not eaten since breakfast. The rhythm of the car became very soothing and she drifted into a short sleep. It wasn't until they reached the village that Chiamaka woke and realized the true extent of her mistake. This was no ordinary place. It was a remote traditional village where things were done differently. They all alighted from their cars and Bello gave them directions to take her to the center of the village, where men and women surrounded her. Chiamaka's pleas fell on deaf ears as she promised not to ever repeat such an act. There was no escape now. Bello had handed her over to the people of his clan. What were they planning to do to her? Where was she? This was not a police station. Chiamaka tried to plead with them, but they were unmoved. They had never seen someone like her before, greedy and deceitful, and they had a way of dealing with such women. She turned to Bello frantically, asking him to forgive her. Chiamaka, he said softly, you've tricked and stolen from the wrong people. Now you will serve the deity of this land, tending to the shrine for the rest of your days. What? She screamed. I don't understand. Deity? What's deity? But with those final words, Bello turned away from her, and with his men, they walked back to the van. Her heart pounded with fear. She realized too late the cost of her actions. The people began to chant, and the air seemed to grow thick with the weight of the moment. They dragged her with them to a structure that looked like a shrine. Chiamaka stood frozen in the center of the sacred place, her body trembling as the women of Bello's village gathered around her. The air was thick with the scent of burning incense, and the sound of beating drums filled the shrine, echoing in her chest. It was as if the very land itself was alive with an ancient energy, pulsing with the presence of the deity. It was here that Chiamaka would pay the price for her deceit, and she could feel the weight of that reality sinking in with every passing moment. The shrine itself was a majestic sight, a structure crafted from red clay and adorned with intricate carvings of symbols that told stories of the gods and ancestors. It stood in the heart of the village, a sacred place where only the chosen were allowed to enter. The shrine was surrounded by tall, thick trees whose branches seemed to stretch toward the sky, as though protecting the sacred ground below. The air was thick with the sound of chanting, the voice of the women joining in a unified song that seemed to weave through the very atmosphere. As Chiamaka was led into the circle of people, her heart pounded in her chest, and a cold sweat formed on her brow. She had tried to remain calm, but the reality of her situation was undeniable. She had no choice but to submit to this ritual. The consequences of her actions now fully realized. The women and men's faces were stern, their expressions unwavering. They were not there to show her mercy. They were there to guide her into her new life, one of silence, service, and devotion to the deity who had been honored for centuries in this village. The ceremony began with the elders of the village stepping forward. The oldest man, his face lined with years of wisdom, held a small bowl filled with white chalk, ground fine and soft. This was sacred in many African traditions, symbolizing purity and the cleansing of the spirit. He approached Chiamaka and began to smear the chalk across her face, first her forehead, then her cheeks, her nose, and finally her chin. Each stroke was deliberate, the smooth white powder marking her as one who was to be cleansed of her past life, her sins, and her deceit. As the chalk was applied, Chiamaka's thoughts raced. She could feel the cool powder settle into her skin, a stark contrast to the heat of the ceremony. She had never imagined herself in a place like this. A life of luxury and deceit. The days spent luring men into her web now seemed like a distant dream, a fantasy life she would never return to. The old man chanted some more, then proceeded to wash her face clean with water. Next came the most terrifying part of the ceremony, the shaving of her hair. The women gathered around Chiamaka, their movements synchronized as they prepared for this sacred art. Chiamaka's hair, which had always been her pride, her crowning glory, was the symbol of her beauty, but also a symbol of her vanity and greed, which she maintained with ill gotten wealth. The women moved with precision, their hands steady as they shaved away Chiamaka's hair, cutting it down to the very roots. Her scalp tingled as the last strands were shaved off, leaving her vulnerable and exposed. The act was symbolic of her transformation, the severing of her old identity to make way for the new. Once her hair was completely shaved, Chiamaka was given a small basin of water to wash her face and hands. She dipped her hands into the cool water, the sound of the splashing water mingling with the drumming, the rhythm of the beats growing louder and more intense. As the water washed away the sweat, she could feel the shift within her, a sense of surrender, of resignation to her fate. The women handed her a plain cotton dress, simple yet functional, and they helped her slip into the garment. The fabric was rough against the skin, a stark contrast to the fine dresses she had once worn. She felt the weight of its simplicity, the humble nature of the life she was now bound to. As Chiamaka dressed, one of the women placed the palm frond in her mouth. It was a symbol of silence, a vow that she would no longer speak of her past life, no longer use her voice for manipulation and deceit. The frond was cool and fibrous, pressing against her lips, and Chiamaka's mouth closed around it reluctantly. She tried to speak, to protest, but the frond stilled her, and the sound of her voice was silenced. It was a mark of her submission, her acceptance of the new role she was being forced into. The vow of silence would bind her to the shrine for the rest of her life. No longer would she speak of her tricks, her lies, or her manipulations. She would serve the deity, tending to the shrine in complete silence. The drums began to play louder, their beat growing more urgent, as if calling to the very spirit of the earth. The sound reverberated through the village, the low, resonating thump of the drum mixed with the high-pitched rhythm of smaller instruments, creating a hypnotic and mesmerizing effect. The women began to dance, their movements fluid and graceful, their bodies swaying to the beat of the drums. Their arms lifted, swelled, and dropped in synchronized patterns, each movement a prayer, each step a devotion to the deity they served. Chiamaka stood still, watching the dance unfold around her, her body trembling. She could not join in the dance. She had no voice and no strength left. She was now a servant of the deity, dedicated to it, bound to silence and servitude. The ceremony continued into the night, the beat of the drums never ceasing, the chants growing louder and more fervent as the women danced and praised the god they revered. Chiamaka stood at the center of it all. Her transformation was complete. The life she had known had been stripped away, replaced by a new existence, one of silence, service, and devotion to the god of the shrine. The ritual was not just a punishment, it was a consecration, a transformation that bound her to this place forever. She thought of her mother, alone and probably searching frantically for her. She thought of her dear friend Mirabel, loyal and steadfast, and always looking out for her welfare. Who was going to tell them now what had become of her? She felt increasingly weak as her energy appeared to lift off of her like a cloak. As the ceremony reached its climax, the people hurried her along an overgrown path to a lake at the edge of the village. The deity's presence filled the air, and she could feel the weight of the spirits surrounding her. The single palm frond in her mouth, the silence within her. These were the symbols of her new life. She had been consecrated, and now she would serve the deity for all her days. There would be no turning back. She had paid the ultimate price for her greed, trapped in a life she never imagined. The men and women of the village had taken her, dedicated her to their deity, and Chiamaka would spend the rest of her days in service to a force greater than herself. Her beauty, her charm, and her deceitful ways now her burden for all eternity. Chiamaka, the beautiful one, then bowed her head in total submission.